Hello, welcome to our 30th talk. We're 3/4 of the way through this series on Genesis, the first 3 chapters. And we've reached a verse in chapter 3 which is almost comical. It's after the fall of Adam and Eve, after their sin. We read, the eyes of both of them were opened and they realized that they were naked, so they sewed fig leaves together and made coverings for themselves. As I said, if it were not so tragic, it would be comical. It's almost like one's worst nightmare, being found outdoors in public, naked. It's one of those recurring dreams or nightmares which people are supposed to have. And what they rapidly did was make preparation to cover their embarrassment. But before this sin, and before this moment, we read in chapter 2 of Genesis, verse 25, that they were naked and felt no shame. So what this text records is a movement from feeling no shame to shame and embarrassment. You know, God has set within us a faculty which responds to moral failure. Some animals share this faculty with us in a measure. For instance, if a dog pinches food, it may cower away, feeling a sense of guilt, but that's more about learned behavioural responses. But with human beings, we have this moral capacity called conscience, placed in us by God. And again, we can learn to use our conscience as well, or to abuse them. We have other faculties. For instance, we use our eyesight to differentiate between brightness and darkness, different luminosity. We use our auditory sense to differentiate between high-pitched or low-pitched sound, between high volume or low volume. So we have these faculties, and we have our conscience faculty to help us to differentiate between moral right and wrong, good and evil. It was King Stanislas, the Polish king, who said this: our conscience warns us as a friend before it punishes us as a judge. And that would be true of Adam and Eve. Before Eve took that fruit in the first case, she had said in response to the temptation, we mustn't eat that from that tree. But then she succumbed. So she had this sense of moral wrongness about taking that fruit. And yet she succumbed. And then their nakedness after their sin, whilst it's a physical reality and their embarrassment at that, it's also indicative or symbolic of a deep-seated shame. They felt exposed by their guilt. Now, shame has many physical manifestations, for instance, dilating of the pupils, sweating, increased heart rate or pulse, and these are aspects of shame. Now, over time, they will go away, they will lessen. The pupils will not be dilated anymore, the sweating will cease, the heart rate would recover. So our shame can be short-lived, but our guilt is real and lasting. Guilt and shame are different but related. And guilt cannot be removed except by a deep work of cleansing and forgiveness by God. We stand guilty before a holy God in terms of our words and deeds and thoughts, and we need a deep cleansing and forgiveness by God. Shame can go, but guilt remains. And in fact, shame is not always a good indicator. There are people who feel no shame. It might be that willfully and habitually they have carried out deeds in such a way that they've made a shipwreck of their conscience, a shipwreck, and desensitized their sense of shame. Well, Adam and Eve did feel acutely ashamed and immediately tried to cover themselves up. They tried to skulk away from God's presence and hide between the trees and the bushes away from his presence. But thankfully, God was not content to leave them there. He sought them out, and he had a plan to solve their awful and dire state. So, just a reflection on moving from no shame to shame and the difference between shame and guilt and how guilt needs to be dealt with. Here's something for you to reflect upon. What are you ashamed of? Do you unwisely imagine that you can cover your tracks and fool God? What needs to change? Well, thank you for listening, and look out for the next talk in this series, Genesis, the first 3 chapters.